enjoying the patriotic music, everybody? Oh, me too. I love a good patriotic song. Thank you for being here tonight. This is the first night of our summer seminar series entitled America at 250, Remember, Rejoice, Renew. Say those three words with me. Remember, rejoice, renew. That's what we're going to do throughout our Wednesday nights in the summer. We're going to remember our nation's heritage. This is our 250th anniversary as a nation, and we're celebrating our nation's heritage, its founding. And so we're remembering God's providence. We're rejoicing. We're rejoicing in the freedoms we have as Americans and freedoms we have in Christ. So we're rejoicing, and also we're renewing our hearts. Renewing our hearts with a greater purpose for God's work in this country and throughout the world and for the future. So I know you're going to enjoy this series. This is going to be a good time that we're going to have together. And we're going to have some special nights. All the nights are special. But then we're going to have some very special nights along the way. We're going to have a patriotic music night. We're going to have a film night. We're going to have a creation science panel here. And then we're going to end the series by having a guest speaker, David Barton. How many of you know David Barton? David Barton, you're going to want to hear him. You're going to want to be here for that. We're inviting area churches as well. We want a large crowd for that night to hear David Barton from Wall Builders Ministry. And that's how we'll close it out. So just commit to come every Wednesday night if you can. If you can be here, just come every Wednesday night. Now, before we go any further, I have a few announcements. First of all, our family day is coming up. You've heard that announcement, our family day and our picnic. It's coming up on Sunday, July 5th. Perfect timing, Sunday, July 5th. And we're going to focus on our homes, our family at home, and then also focus on our church family. Only a 10:15 a.m. service that day. Our guest speaker is Pastor Rob Redlin. And after the service, we're going to have the classic picnic with burgers and hot dogs and all the fixins, as they say, everything that goes with it. We're going to have that and some games and fun out there on the field. So make sure you sign up for that. You must sign up or we won't have a meal for you. So if you want to eat, we need to know that you're coming. So Sunday, June 21st is the last day to register for the picnic. If you want a meal, if you want to enjoy the picnic to the fullest, you need to sign up by June the 21st. College students, you're invited. You need to sign up as well. So you can go on Realm or you can go to the website. You can also use the QR codes that you see in the lobbies on your way out tonight. So make sure to sign up by the 21st. We have to know by then. Connect is this Saturday, our ministry where we go out and canvass the community. This Saturday at 9 a.m. in the gathering place, we meet, we have breakfast, we pray together, and then we go out with flyers and talk to people about our church and about the gospel. This time, we're going to be handing out Vacation Bible School flyers. And have you noticed the billboards about our Vacation Bible School? Have you seen those out there? On Airport Road, I saw one on Davis today. Our billboards advertising Vacation Bible School. We want to reach as many children as possible. We want to reach their families. And so let's get out there and hand out some invitations this Saturday at 9 a.m. You need to sign up as well so we have enough pancakes for that. So sign up on Realm or on our website if you plan to attend. Just a reminder that our Sunday morning Bible study ministry doesn't meet again until July 12th, Sunday, July 12th. So just keep that in mind. You can come at 9 o'clock on Sundays if you want to. You can sit there if you'd like and get the preview of the choir practice if you'd like, okay? But there's no Bible studies meeting at 9 a.m. until July 12th. Hey, if you're not yet connected to a Bible study, this would be a great time for you to investigate, check out the different groups that are available. You can go to campuschurch.com/Bible study groups and learn about the different groups that you could attend and participate with. Last of all, I'm sad to say, I know you were looking forward to this, but because of the wet field conditions, we are not going to have the watermelon fellowship tonight. At the count of three, say, aw. 1, 2, 3. Just get it out. Okay. So no watermelon tonight. So it'll just give us another week of anticipation, okay? So next Wednesday night after the service, weather permitting, we will have the watermelon fellowship. Our speaker tonight is Dr. John Reese. Dr. Reese and I were in college together back in the day. He was in the same collegiate group that I was in at Pensacola Christian College. We really looked up to John as a spiritual leader on campus, and he still is today. And he began his teaching career at Pensacola Christian Academy in 1985. He was a high school history and chemistry teacher. Then he moved to Pensacola Christian College to teach history and education classes in the undergraduate and graduate level. He serves as the lead instructor for the history faculty, and he is the former chair of the history department, vice chair of the PCC faculty committee. He earned his bachelor's degree and master's degree at Pensacola Christian College, and he has a PhD in history from Florida State University. If you know Dr. Reese, you know his sense of humor, and you know that he's a brilliant man. Also, he loves history. He just speaks of it often. He loves to dress up in period characters and these historical figures and present those melodramas to local churches, homeschool groups, college functions. He's dressed up and spoken as Patrick Henry, Charles Lindbergh, Martin Luther, and many others. He and his wife, Beth, are active members here at Campus Church. He's a former deacon. Currently, he serves as our 23 and older college student Bible study teacher. He volunteers in other ministries. You're going to enjoy hearing him tonight. We're looking forward to having him speak to start off this series. We're going to sing a song. I'll pray. We're going to watch a short video about our first president, George Washington, and then after the video, Dr. Reese will come speak. Let's all stand together. Let's all sing Freedom in You. Let's sing it out. Sing it with enthusiasm. Father in heaven, we come to you with anticipation, with excitement, and with gratitude. We thank you for our great nation. And we know, Lord, that it was because of your work, your providence, and your blessing that we stand here today in this great country with the freedoms that we have. You have used this country to be a mission-sending agency, to further the gospel. And we thank you, Lord, for all that you're doing here, and we're glad to be a part of it. We celebrate tonight. I pray that you would use Dr. Reese to encourage us, Lord, to give us appreciation, greater appreciation for all that we have. Please work through him and bless the rest of the service. In Jesus' name, everyone said, you may be seated.
George Washington's life stands as a powerful testimony to God's providence at work through imperfect leaders in uncertain times. From his earliest military experiences, Washington found himself preserved in ways that defied human explanations. During the French and Indian War, under General Braddock, he rode directly through heavy fire. Bullets tore through his coat, yet not one struck his body. Years later, he reflected on these moments with humility, writing, "By the all-powerful dispensations of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability and expectation." This was not the language of a man who trusted merely in strategy or strength. Washington believed deeply that God was actively guiding the course of his life and, more importantly, the future of the nation. Throughout the Revolutionary War, his leadership was marked not by arrogance, but by dependence. He regularly called for days of prayer and fasting among the troops and the young nation, recognizing that victory would not come by human might alone. Nowhere is this more evident than at Valley Forge. In the bitter winter of 1777 and 1778, the Continental Army suffered greatly. Lack of food, insufficient clothing, disease, and low morale. It was a place of testing, of stripping away confidence in self. And in that place, Washington led not merely as a general, but as a man seeking God. Accounts and traditions recall him in prayer. And while historians debate the specifics, what is undisputed is his consistent emphasis on dependence upon God in both public orders and private correspondence. Valley Forge became a place of preparation. The army that emerged was not only more disciplined, but more unified. What appeared to be a place of weakness became the foundation of future strength. Washington understood something that leaders often forget, that seasons of hardship are often the very tools God uses to prepare both individuals and nations for what lies ahead. He also consistently resisted the temptation of power. At the end of the war, when he could have taken authority for himself, he instead relinquished it, setting a precedent for peaceful leadership transition that would shape the identity of the United States. This humility reflected his belief that authority ultimately belonged to God, not man. Washington's legacy reminds us that nations are not shaped merely by strategy, strength, or charisma. They are shaped by leaders who recognize the hand of God in events they cannot control. His life calls us to remember that God's providence is not only seen in victories, but in preservation, preparation, and even suffering. And it challenges us to lead, not with self-reliance, but with humility, prayer, and trust in the unseen hand that guides all things.
Wow, that's a powerful presentation. Not only did he have bullet holes in his clothes there in that particular battle, he had 2 horses shot out from under him. The Lord was working in a tremendous way. Imperfect, yes. He was known to have a little bit of a temper and to swear occasionally. But you know, the old history text always quickly added that he was always able to control it. The more modern versions leave that last portion out because there's a tendency nowadays to try to respin, to rewrite history. Well, let me say, first of all, thank you, Pastor Zach and the whole church staff for having a vision for a series like this. I think the potential is fantastic. I'm honored to be a part of the lineup here. I was thinking about what the 250-year anniversary means to all of us, and it's only appropriate that we would take time to look back in time, as it were. And there's biblical foundation for this. I like the 3-part emphases that we have here. We're going to remember, and then we take that time to rejoice, to show gratitude, and then to renew. You know, history is more than just an antiquarian pursuit. History is about providing a guide for us. It's one of the best tutorials, one of the best teachers out there. And so I hope that at the beginning of this 11-part series that you'll prayerfully consider, Lord, how can I benefit from this? How can I improve in my spiritual walk? How can I be challenged, encouraged, perhaps indicted by some of the storylines that we'll have a chance to examine together. And I want to tip a hat to those of you joining us here from far and near. Hope that you will find this helpful as well. For some of you, this will perhaps be a review, a fair bit, although I've tried to go off the main trail a little bit from time to time to add a little bit more. For those that want to dive deeper in, we'll provide some resources to which you can turn. But for others, this may be brand new. There is a spirit out there today which says we ought to hang our heads in shame, that America was founded on the wrong principles and we're just really need a total redo. We're here to challenge that. I think, Pastor Zach, for too long, we've let the historical Canaanites call the shots. It's time that we take back good ground, amen? And for some of you, though, this may be new, and you may be challenged a bit. You say, well, I hadn't heard it that way before. So I want to put this out for all of us. If there's a topic that you want to have addressed, feel free to email the campus church. Maybe it's a clarification, perhaps it's a theme. What about those Salem witch trials? What do we do about that? Is it true that the quintessential concern that every Puritan had is that someone was having fun somewhere? There are all kinds of things we can delve into. We only have so much time, but I encourage you to take advantage of that if you're so inclined. As we get started here tonight, though, I want to just focus a little bit on why it is that we study history itself. I love this sequence that was put together, and thanks, Pastor Zach. He provided much of this outline, gave guidance and direction, and I just jumped on board for the ride. You'll see, history teaches itself. We just jump on board for the ride. And we cannot study the history of America without seeing the hand of God's providence at work. The Bible reminds us of that concept time and time again, to learn from the past, to review the past. There's a passage that you can find in Psalm 77 if you have your Bible or your device. Perhaps you can just follow along on the screen if you wish. But let me read this as we get started, and note this emphasis on looking backward to learn from it. Not to live in the past, but to benefit from it, to be reminded, to be encouraged even. It says in verse 11 of Psalm 77, I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely. I'm thinking, as he's writing this, how about crossing the Red Sea? That was quite a work, wasn't it? See, without a historical context, we don't appreciate what the Lord has done for us and what he will do going forward, even though we may not script it that way every time. But it goes on to say, I will remember thy wonders of old. I will meditate, verse 12, also of all thy work and talk of thy doings. Thy way, O God, is in this sanctuary. Who is so great a God as our God? That's a rhetorical question, isn't it? Is there any other like our God? Verse 14, thou art the God that doest wonders. Thou hast declared thy strength among the people. I see in the first two verses the notion of meditation. It's a good thing. It's a healthy thing for us to take the time to think back through and contemplate what the Lord has done. Perhaps areas where we've fallen short of the mark and how that we can learn and benefit from that. In the middle portion of this passage, though, I like this challenge to God's holiness and uniqueness. I think sometimes we kind of go on our way in a cavalier fashion. We really don't stop to think about how holy God really is. That's his central character. Everything builds out from that. And I believe the founding fathers had a sense of that as well. Years ago, I got a letter from my pastor back in my home state of Pennsylvania. I'd been on staff just for a few years in the Pensacola area. And he said, Dr. Reese, what about this letter to the editor where they're saying the founding fathers were all deists? Okay, and I've heard that bromide before. And so I wrote a response, and essentially I told the folks in that editorial, which they published, don't judge all of the founding fathers by the words and actions of 4 or 5. There are about 200 of them. And I'm here to attest to the fact, based on my study of the topic, and I don't claim to have a corner on all of the knowledge here, but as I've studied this issue for nearly 50 years now, the founding fathers, by and large, were members in good standing of recognized religious sects, and they had a sense of respect for God's holiness. And that's what we're told to do right there in verse 13. Verse 14 then is that reminder again of God's supernatural power. So as we think about this whole business of the study of history, I'm going to make a statement that may seem a bit strong, but I want you to contemplate it with me and see if you agree or not. Next to the study of God's word, to know the way of salvation and discipleship, one of the wisest investments any of us can make is in the study of history. You say, oh, come on, Reese, you're biased. That happens to be your area of study and discipline. No, I really mean that. And here's my basis for saying that. History is that guide. It's that teacher. It's a mirror to society. It shows us where people have been. If we don't know where we've been, do we know where we are today or where we're going? And Pastor Zach would know this, that almost half of the Bible is in a narrative format. And history is nothing more than God's sovereign plan worked out in time. Think about that. It's God's sovereign plan worked out in time. And so we do well to reflect. And on this special occasion, a once in a 250-year opportunity, we want to delve into that just a little bit more here. Let's give one quick example. We need to get to our work then. Let's take the Assyrians of the Old Testament. I choose that topic because most of us that are studied in scriptures at all know some of the story. But history adds that three-dimensional approach that we may not otherwise be able to obtain. When you hear the story about Jonah being called by the Spirit of God to go to Nineveh and how he reacted, you say, well, he was just out of God's will. He was rebelling. But wait a minute. Look at the context here. The Assyrians were what I like to call the desert Vikings of the day. They were fierce. They were the ones that used steel-tipped arrows, steel-tipped swords. They had steel chariots, steel wheels on their chariots. They wrapped leather around them for a little bit of a cushion. But they'd put these blades sticking out, Ben-Hur style, and they'd charge right into the enemy, just filleting people alive. And when they sieged a city and it finally surrendered, they would kill the inhabitants, tack their skins to the outside wall of the city, and then stack the heads up in pyramids. As a reminder to anyone else walking by, this is what happens if you resist the Assyrians. Now do you understand why Jonah reacted like he did? We don't justify it. But with that historical context in place, so he runs to Joppa, jumps in a ship, and heads for Spain. He's going the opposite direction. But see, here's a beautiful principle of history. God's will always be accomplished. And so what did he do? He sent a submarine. As far as I know in my study of history, Pastor Burdick, the first time that we have reference to a submarine is not the turtle in the War for Independence. That was a real thing. But it was actually when that great fish swallowed Jonah. And it even had an ejection seat, didn't it? Right? Back up on land. And watch this now. He went to Nineveh, and the Lord did a great work. And for a brief juncture at least, the people of Nineveh were in a proper relationship with God. Now, isn't that a beautiful principle? If we don't have that historical context, though, those stories just don't come to light as well. So the point is well taken here, I trust. So what I'd like to do as we get started is take us out to a cornfield. My name is John Reese, and I'd like to welcome you to my corn patch. Now, some of you may be wondering, what does a corn patch like this have to do with America 250 or the founding of this great land of ours? I have something I want to show you, so come along. Here it is, a hoe. Now, for hundreds of years, people have used implements like this to maintain weed control, to produce food and sustenance for their families. And one such person was Captain Stephen Harding, my grandfather on my mother's side, 6 generations removed. He had purchased a 400-acre farm in northeastern Pennsylvania along with a sawmill. And on this particular occasion, it's now June of 1778, there were the stirrings of some attacks. The British had incited the Indians to launch some raids and attacks. But no one would have guessed on that fateful day, June 30, 1778, what was to occur. It was the kind of day that every frontier family feared. The group of Harding boys and some others went out to a corn patch, not unlike this, and they hoed all day long. As dusk began to settle in, just about this time of the day, they packed their goods up and prepared to head home. That's when they were suddenly attacked by an Indian group. At the end of the skirmish, 2 of the Harding brothers lay dead and scalped. The rest managed to escape. Some were actually captured and later killed. That kind of story can be and has been repeated time and time again. And I think they serve as stark reminders of the price that was paid for the freedoms that we enjoy today. We also see, though, in our study of the founding era, God's providence at work and man's perseverance. What I'd like to do is invite you to join me on a journey back in time. And we'll have the opportunity together to explore the events and the people that helped to build this land of the free and home of the brave. If you visit northeastern Pennsylvania, you'll see a couple monuments that have been constructed in their honor. Interesting, one of the other brothers managed to jump into the Susquehanna River, and he hid in the reeds right alongside the shoreline. He later testified that it was dusk, and apparently the Indians spotted the fact that they'd been discovered, and they didn't want that news to spread, so dead people don't tell tales. The idea was to just massacre this whole group. But he hid in the water. He said later he could have reached out and touched the moccasin of one of those searching for him. He later swam downstream, got back to the fort where they'd been staying, and shared the story that you're hearing tonight. If you want to take a deeper dive, and we will do this from time to time, as I intimated earlier, this is a great read, Alan Urquhart's book, The Wilderness War. Now, he doesn't quite get it right on the Hardings. He has father-son being killed. It was actually two brothers. But here's God's providence at work. Tragic day in the lives of that family. The dad, Stephen, had 12 sons, 2 of them just taken out like that. But the 2 other sons survived that day. One other son actually went on to serve in the military, got his discharge papers from George Washington, but Dad, Stephen Harding, took a whole group of 300 of militia off to serve, and because of that, he was given some land in Ohio. So one branch went west, that's President Warren Harding's side. The other branch stayed in northeastern Pennsylvania, and that's where my mother comes from. So in all of that hardship, there was positive that came out of that. We do need to get on to our work, but one other quick illustration, with your permission. You know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Although with inflation as it is, now it's down to about 750 words. But there's still a lot we can see in a picture even like this. This is a farm where I grew up, and 10 brothers and sisters. With that many running around, my parents just couldn't keep an eye on everyone at once. And so there was usually something going on, exciting. This was purchased by an Amish family, and so you see the buggy there. But just behind that buggy was actually a set of gasoline tank. There was a 500-gallon fuel tank for gas and one for diesel. And one day I strolled out of the house and found my kid brother comfortably ensconced on top of that 500-gallon gas tank, lighting matches and dropping them into the recharge. I kid you not. I don't know how many guardian angels had cardiac arrest that day, but humanly speaking, the only reason he didn't blow that up into a 500-pound gasoline bomb is that it had just been recharged, and as you may know, liquid gas does not burn. It's in this same picture a little bit closer up. I would decide I was going to play sheep one day, and my older sister decided she was going to play helicopter with a barn scraper. So she's twirling in circles, and she gets a little dizzy, and I get it clipped on the head. So there's a lot that I can tell you about just by looking at that picture, but I wanted to draw your attention to one corner in particular. Oh, there was one other. I remember the year that it was so rainy we couldn't get on to spray the cornfields, so we had to hoe 26 acres of corn by hand. I can relate to the Harding brothers just a little bit on that count. And I had a brother once again got a little wowed, and he nailed me. I still have the scar to show for it right here, Pastor Zach. But it did get me out of 3 days of hoeing. But the thing that I draw our attention to is that little corner on that outbuilding. 1963, my dad was painting that very section when my mother stepped out. I was less than a year old, so I don't remember this personally, obviously, and announced that the president had been shot in Dallas, President Kennedy. And he, like everyone else, went to the nearest radio, and they listened in. And he never did paint that last section. It was always weatherborne. And every time we painted that building, we would leave that last little 16-inch strip as our little memento or monument, as it were. I took my own family back to visit the family farm years later, and I was quick to get over and look at that very section. You know what I found, Pastor? It had been painted over. See, the next family didn't know the story. They didn't have that sense of history, so they just crassly painted right on over it, right? So it is important for us to take that time to look back so that we know better how to live. If I could take all of what we're going to talk about here in these 11 sessions, and I think I speak for the others here as well, it would be this. We would desire that all of us would purpose to be like those children of Issachar. See, they had an understanding of the time so that they knew how to live. See, that's the deal. This is not just about a history lesson. This is about helping us to better live our lives for Christ, for our country, our international students, for you to have a little bit more of a sense of how God has used this country uniquely, and how that you perhaps can take some of these ideas back to your country as well. So in the terms of former Rejoice pastor Dr. Mullinex, I'm going to use 3 observations in my talk tonight in the time we have left. And the first is this: history, America's founding rather, was not accidental. Now, if PhD historians were listening to this right now, the flags would be going up, the lights would be blinking. They'd say, whoa, wait a minute, Reese. Don't bring Providence in history. That's not the science of history. I want to deal with that in the next session if I can. So if you want to stay tuned and come back for that, we'll see if we can develop that a little bit further here. But let's assume, for conversation's sake, and I hope to show as much here, that America was founded not by accident, but because of a precise plan that God had, despite wicked men, despite frail men, and those that had shortcomings and whatnot. Maybe this would be an appropriate conversation. I was conversing with a couple of my son and daughter-in-law here a couple weeks back as I was husking corn late one night, and we got into this topic here, the difference between sovereignty and providence. And it got me to thinking a little bit more. Sovereignty, by definition, is to be sovereign is to have all power, to be supreme. God is sovereign. We say that God is sovereign over all of the universe, and no one in the Christian realm would challenge that statement. But what about this business of providence? How does that fit in? And by the way, we can't understand all aspects of God's sovereignty. I don't plan to make this a theological discussion at all, but I'll say it this way and see if this makes sense to you. God's sovereignty is, in a sense, sort of like the driving force behind history. I said earlier that history is the outworking of God's sovereign plan in time. I'll stand by that. And so, in a sense, God's sovereignty is this master plan. Now, he has his perfect will, he has his permissive will or passive will, because man has a free choice. That's a beautiful thing. We're not just robots. And oftentimes, man makes the wrong choice. And the highway of history is strewn with the results of that. But I'm happy to announce, and you're aware of this too, aren't you? There are times where man makes the right choice. Righteousness exalteth the nation. There are those purple patches to history. I love studying those as well. But despite all of that, God has a plan that is going to be accomplished. We've read the last chapter. We know how it ends. Then secondly, just as these are assumptions or axioms, not only does God's will always get accomplished, number two, he sometimes will use the wickedness of man. He doesn't ordain wicked. He's not the author of wickedness, right? But God will allow a wicked Assyrian empire to bring judgment on his own people, you see. And so those are driving principles behind much of what we have to share here tonight. But how does providence fit into that? I would suggest that providence is the mechanism by which God, this driving force through history called God's sovereignty, the mechanism that he uses often is providence, where he directly intervenes. And here's where I part company with a number of my colleagues who would say that the historian has to be detached from history. We have to be objective, and that we should. But that we ought not bring providence into it. We can be Christian, that's fine, but we ought not bring this into the equation at all. To me, to study history without studying providence, it's like the medical person that's diagnosing an illness, and it has to do with cancer and all, and they're an oncologist, and they do the whole workup, and the person has a big tumor on their thigh. By the way, Washington had 2 tumors removed from his thigh, and they never once mentioned that term. Wait a minute, you're not being thorough in your work if you don't cover all aspects. And so providence is very much a part of the story. When we look at the Constitution, and the clock's against me here today, so we're going to need to move at pace. The Constitution itself is not a wonder document. Number one, we don't worship the Constitution. We don't worship the Declaration of Independence. But we see how that God used these documents and the writers thereof in a tremendous way, in a very unique way. But this Constitution is not one of those magical wands. All right, we'll just take this over to Iraq. So we'll displace one leader and we'll put this system into place, and voila, we have this perfect system. Now, a year later, we're back to Sharia law. Why? Because our form of government requires a certain morality. It requires a certain foundation. And our third session will address that a little bit more fully here. But one of the things the Constitution was intended to do was actually to put shackles on man, because man does have a sin nature. And there's that tendency to lust to power, and then more power. And there comes a point where things are just out of control. So even Thomas Jefferson himself said, our Constitution is written to bind down, to hold back, to put into place those aspirations. One other reminder, we go back to our passage that we started with in our study of history. Memory is a beautiful thing. I want to do more with that in session 2 as well. Some of you old timers, I think you'll appreciate our introduction for that, so stay tuned there. But as we think about how God worked in the founding of this nation, I'm just going to give a few snapshots here. We don't have time to do a blow-by-blow, a chronological overview, but just some highlights here along the way. And one of those, here's a little bit off of the beaten trail, a term that you may not have come across in your studies, but a very fascinating person indeed, Richard Hakluyt. He actually was a clergyman. He was also a geographer and a professor. And he wrote a number of works here. He was great at taking maps and putting things together, and he wrote several volumes. This is one of those 3-volume works. That's a long title, isn't it? Pastor Zach, you see why they call them title pages? It takes the whole page just to get the title on there. But as a Protestant, one of his driving passions was to get the gospel to the New World. Now, this is not included in most of the text, but it's there for those who want to do the spade work. Go back and check it out. And he said, now the Spanish are already there. So if you're going to go to the New World, here's what you have to do. You need to get upstream. Get away from the coastline so you don't get those marauders coming by and so on and so forth. Why did Jamestown folk go upstream? They were following this guy's work here. And he loved to use this verse right out of Scripture. They which go down the sea in ships and occupy by the great waters, they see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. So in the 1580s, here's a man that had a vision. And he went to Queen Elizabeth, and he went to others, and began promoting this idea of English colonies in the New World. One of the first to respond was a group that settled in Jamestown. That's the first permanent English settlement. Years ago, I had the opportunity to do a history seminar on this subject. And in my study of Captain John Smith, I learned some fascinating things. It's one of the most common names in the English realm there, and yet a most uncommon man. Captain John Smith here. When he was just 8 years old, the Spanish Armada was making its way up past England, and he saw those bonfires being lit from hill to hill to hill. He had no idea what was coming down, but God in his providence in 1588 was blocking, thwarting a plan. If that war had gone the other direction, we might be reading out of the Vulgate today. We don't know. I know that the Dutch struck a coin after that whole thing settled down, and it said on the one side, man proposes, and on the obverse side, God disposes. He was just 8 years old. If I had the time to regale you with the details, I could rehearse at least 5 or 6 times when he should have been dead before he was 22 years of age. But God in his providence chose to spare his life. He had a Jonah-like experience. He was on board a ship going through the Mediterranean. Most of the people on board were Romanists. They hit hard waters. They found out he was a Protestant, so they tossed him overboard. They literally did, threw overboard. Fortunately, it was near an island. He got to that island, and the next ship that happened by, that's the way the secular historian likes to share it. I was at a symposium on the Battle of Midway, sponsored by the Navy. 2,000 World War II vets all gathered there, and I was just soaking in like a sponge. And the historian moderator got up and said, well, as Lady Luck would have it. And he went on with his spiel. There is no such thing. See, God, he's super intense. He watches over, and there are those times when he will directly intervene. The next ship that came by was one captained by his friend. And he went on to do some great feats there that we don't have time to deal with here today. But eventually, 1607, they make their way to the New World. In a ship not unlike the one we have up here in the model, but the ones pictured here, small ships. If you've ever seen the replicas, you'll be struck by how small these ships were. Now, it's true that the Jamestown folk were not coming for expressly religious purposes. They had more of an economic drive, men and boys only, no women for the first couple of years. However, not included in most of the textbooks is the fact that they still planted a 7-foot oak cross when they landed at Cape Comfort. I can't read my own writing here. Cape Henry, thank you. And then, of course, they went upstream. They didn't go 100 miles. They went about 60 miles and landed at Jamestown. As you know, it was rather swampish territory and all. Boy, they hit on some hard times, didn't they? But God, even through all of that, they call it the seasoning process, that first year or two in a new world. It was a tough go for them, as you know, but then God used Captain John Smith in a great way to bring order and decorum. Throw out that socialist system. If you don't work, you don't eat. Here's your plot, you plant your own corn. And it had a marvelous effect. But he was injured in a terrible gunpowder explosion, so he had to leave in 1609. Within a year, things had unraveled again. Did you know that for a period of about 6 hours, the first permanent English settlement in the New World was abandoned? That's right. They took a scout. They had one last ship there, and they were sailing downstream. There was no hope. They were getting out of there when a reprovision ship happened to be coming upstream. So for 6 hours, the place was actually unoccupied. The story of the Pilgrims is perhaps a little more familiar and certainly has that religious fervor to it. But again, there's a backstory that we may or may not be aware of even there. We did a talk on that topic here on the 400-year anniversary and had a chance to do some of the backlog research on that. You probably know, of course, they left Plymouth primarily because of persecution. In session 2, let's go back and rehearse some of the foundations as we look at the comparison between faith and freedom. There's a direct correlation, I can argue. At any rate, they went to Leiden, and there they actually had religious freedom. In one of my graduate classes, we talked a little bit about that, and sometimes I'll ask the question, true or false? The Pilgrims came to America seeking religious freedom. Not really. They already had that. Why did they leave the country there? And it's a question that I'll pose to you. From time to time, we'll pop these time tunnel teasers in just to get your mental synapses snapping a little bit. Perhaps you know the answer. Maybe you don't. Here's one. Did the Pilgrims actually call themselves pilgrims? Well, if you read William Bradford, he refers to that passage that talks about there being pilgrims looking much on these things, but lifted up their eyes to heaven, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits. They didn't actually call themselves pilgrims, though. They called themselves saints. At any rate, when they went to Leiden, and I want to come back to that perhaps in session 2, I want to show you why they actually left the Low Country. Some of you know. If you do, don't tell your neighbor. But we'll develop that a little bit more further as we have time and opportunity. But right now, they came over in the Mayflower. You know, they lived inside of this area that was about the size of a tennis court for nearly 60 days. Storms and all the goings on. A tennis court, a single tennis court, or to put it in Pastor Redland's parlance, 2.5 pickleball courts. There were 102 of them. And get this, there was a baby born in the midst of all that. Wow. His name was Oceanus Hopkins. He only lived 6 years. If you go to the reenactments at Plymouth Plantation and ask the Hopkins family folk playing those roles, they know that story. They will tell that to you. But I can't imagine what that was like. And there was one guy who actually was washed overboard, but managed to grab a rope. How about that? Cold waters. He disobeyed orders. He was above deck. He got washed overboard. John Howland, he grabbed that rope. They pulled him aboard. And today there are 3 million people who claim him as their forebearer, including Winston Churchill, George W. Bush, and his dad. How about that? So God in his providence was working even in those very, very difficult circumstances. But when they got to the New World, they were off course. They were not within the political jurisdiction, the legal jurisdiction that they had agreed to. So what did they do? They voluntarily came together. They weren't a bunch of anarchists. They weren't a bunch of lawless people. They came together and they signed the Mayflower Compact. This is the granddaddy of all modern American documents. It all started here. And I asked the question, who was Pastor John Robinson? If you don't know, let's go back to that in session 2. Boy, I'm promising a lot for session 2. Shortly thereafter, the Puritans arrived. And we could take time, if we had a Pastor's Act, to show at least 3 or 4 instances of God's direct providence at work in Plymouth Plantation that first year. Don't have the time. The clock is against us here. But these are highlights. The Puritans came about 10 years later. And they came too with the express purpose that Europe was in a disastrous state. The Reformation occurred, they were a part of that, but they'd seen so much of Europe really unraveling. So in a sense, they were retreating from that. They did believe in a covenant theology, and they believed that they were the new Israel. We don't necessarily embrace that now, but they really felt like they were on a vision to come to the new world here. And shortly after their arrival, they established an institution of higher learning. If you visit Harvard, it's still there. The ACLU has not sandblasted this off of the wall yet, but the purpose in founding Harvard was that they dreaded the idea of an illiterate clergy. If you were to have gone to Harvard in those days, right on a signpost entering into the institution was a carving on the gatepost, a literate clergy. The purpose there was to make sure there were those who could preach the gospel and carry that message forward. Even their crest represented that. You see Christo and Ecclesia, the church, Christ, those were all part of. By the way, the word veritas that they have there are written over 3 different books. Can you see that? The image is not that big, but the 2 books represent the Old and the New Testaments. The 3rd book is upside down. Can you see that? It's upside down. And that's the idea. We've not plumbed the depths. There's more knowledge to be discovered here. If you look at the Harvard crest today, Christos is gone, Ecclesia is gone. It's just now truth. Truth as they choose to define it. This is sad. Some of you that follow religious goings on may be aware of this already, but the mainline denominational seminaries have just gone way off the trail here, now putting plants on stage and praying to them. I call it spiritual bankruptcy. So they began on such a sound foundation, and yet look where they are today. Can we learn a lesson from that? Absolutely. We need to move to our next observation. So first, this nation was not founded by accident. We looked at just a few snapshots of the founding of those colonies. There are many that we have to leave on the table here. But let's move forward now and take a little closer look at God's sovereignty over history. The fact is, spiritually, the colonies were drifting. There was a fervor in the 1620s, in the 1630s, and even in the South, there was still that desire. There were many that followed after. The Presbyterians showed up, the Baptists, they were very zealous. They faced a fair bit of persecution from the Anglicans as a result of that, actually. But over time, there was this cooling spiritually that took place. Some of you may recognize the Halfway Covenant of 1662. There was a sermon preached in the early 1700s, Pastor Zach. The title of this was a Lutheran pastor, on the dangers of an unconverted ministry. How about that? They were drifting that far. And so in a real sense, when God should have sent judgment, instead, he sent Jonathan Edwards. And this is just one of two that we'll highlight. There are many others that we could had we more time. You know the basic storyline, don't you? Jonathan Edwards was used of the Lord in a great way. He was born into good, sturdy Puritan stock. His granddad was the pastor of a church there in the western part of Massachusetts. The Connecticut River almost bisects that area. And Northampton was home for him. So he finished his training at Yale. By the way, he got saved while he was at Yale. So he went to college at age 13, unsaved. I came to religious, spiritual understanding. And his granddad was one of those that bought into the halfway covenant. You don't have to make a profession of faith to be a church member. You're halfway in by merit of being the son and daughter of, and you'll come in time, right? And he said that's compromise. But he didn't really try to rock the boat. He played his part there as assistant pastor until his grandfather passed. And then he took over. And then he began preaching a very strong, unadulterated gospel. Not the type that's an emotional frenzy and whipping you into some kind of froth. No, he read his sermons. But the Lord did a great work. One April Sunday in 1734, you can track it down. The Holy Spirit descended on that church in an unusual way. And they were clutching the pews in front of them. They sat in pew boxes and all. And there was a tremendous work wrought. And it was like a pebble dropped into a placid pond that just began to expand and spread out. And nearby towns began to experience revival. Right across the way in Enfield, 1741, this revival now is about 7-8 years old. He's invited to preach there, the most famous sermon probably in all American history. More people recognize this title than any other, but few know what it's actually about. And those who do look at it, some of them are rather skeptical. What about this God that is so fearsome that he describes man as a spider dangling over this abyss? But what Jonathan Edwards was trying to share is that it was God's grace you hadn't fallen into the fire yet. And there's time. While he was reformed in his theology, he was very evangelistic. That did not in any way affect his zeal for that. A very well-known sermon. Unfortunately, in the years that passed, people forgot. They had no idea. I had a student in my graduate class years ago who told me this story. She gave me a picture and said that this rock was on display at the place where that church had been located. And one day some folks came to town looking. They wanted to see what the location was about. Oh, just go out State Road so-and-so and you'll find the rock there on the side. Well, they came back. They couldn't find it. Well, it was private property. It had been sold, and the new owner had brought in land-moving equipment, pushed all this brush to the back, including this monument. See, they didn't know. People zipping up and down the road had no idea what God had done there in that area. And if we don't know our past, we'll fecklessly give it away. And there are the historical revisionists trying to do just that. Here's a book that's popular in academic circles, has been at least in times past. Frank Lambert, The Inventing of the Great Awakening. How about that? The so-called Great Awakening was a dangerous sham, a delusion that generated enthusiastic heat and commotion of the passions while failing to reform hearts and minds. They go on to argue that really the Great Awakening never occurred. That was something that late 19th century historians came up with to make it look like America was founded as a Christian nation. Do you see how Satan is so shrewd? And he's constantly trying to put a spin on things. That's why we have to constantly go back and check the primary sources. Don't depend on those secondary and tertiary sources. We must move on. George Whitefield crossed the Atlantic 7 times. I call him the apostle to 2 continents, greatly used. Now, he was the firebrand. He was a guy that could get on the pulpit and beat it to a pulp. And he spoke, he preached 40 hours a week. I didn't say he prepared. He preached 40 hours a week on some occasions. Greatly used of the Lord. Both of them died at age 56. Jonathan Edwards, after he became president of Princeton, they had a smallpox issue, so he had submitted to a process where they just dragged a piece of string that's been exposed to smallpox through these little slits in their wrist. Patrick Henry had this done. George Washington had this done. Most of the time you feel ill for a couple of days, then you rebound. 56 years of age, he died. He didn't recover. His time was done, but he left behind 13 children. And you follow that family, the Edwards family, tremendously used the Lord in politics, in theology, in any number of ways. George Whitefield died at age 56, leaving no children behind, but many, many spiritual children. I wish I had the time to regale ourselves with the details of his trip from Georgia all the way up to speak at Jonathan Edwards Church. Wouldn't you love to have been a fly on the wall there? His reception at Harvard was rather cool, I may say. They were already past all that enlightenment stuff. But here are the results. First, there was a great surge in the number of churches and mission outreaches. David Brainerd is a product of that Great Awakening, for example. There were new educational institutions established, schools, private grammar schools, other kinds of schools, colleges. The first 26 of the first 28 colleges founded in this country were founded for religious purposes. 26 out of 28. And 4 of those founded in this time period are names like Princeton and Columbia and Rutgers and Brown. All of them, a direct result of the Great Awakening. God was doing the work. He was preparing the soil. See, the Constitution can't just land anywhere. It has to have the proper soil for it to take hold here. And this was a rather strange concept. It doesn't sound so strange to us today, but religious liberty in this day and time was a novel idea. The idea that we may not all cross our T's and dot our I's the same way, but we can agree to get along so long as we recognize that there is a thrice holy God and these kinds of things. 98% of the colonists were Protestant. There were a few Catholics. There were a few Jews at that time. But political unity also, or liberty I should say, was a great outgrowth of the Great Awakening. I got myself in trouble in my doctoral studies when I argued that this influence was greater than that of the Scottish philosophers and all. But I still stand by my position, and that is the Great Awakening really helped to work the soil, to prepare the way. For example, when Boston gets the Intolerable Acts and they're locked down, how is it that South Carolina is sending wheat, rice, and Pennsylvania is sending wheat and sheep? You see, the colonists were separated from one another. If I was from Pennsylvania, I didn't really care what happened in Virginia. My first loyalty was to my home country. But now there's a unity across social barriers, when Whitefield preached, the slaves would listen to him. When he preached, the well-to-do, Benjamin Franklin even went to hear him when he was in Philadelphia. Determined he wasn't going to give any money in the offering, but the more he listened, the more he decided, well, I'll give a copper. I'll give a shilling. When they took the offering, he dumped his whole purse. So this Whitefield guy was a pretty good offering taker, and he and Franklin became good friends. We'd like to think that Benjamin Franklin heard a wonderful gospel message through him. And his own record is a little bit checkered. Franklin's is, as you well know. We need to move to our third observation. If we could we just kind of put a piece of black tape over this clock? And that is to look at the amazing providence of God in the actual formation. So let's start right there in Lexington. It's now April 18, 1775. There's a lot that's transpired to get us to this point. Paul Revere makes his famous ride. Now, Pastor Zach, you've spent many years in ministry and living in New England, so you may know the answer to this. What was Paul Revere's famous last words when he finished his ride? Whoa. Yeah, there you go. All right, I think it behooves us just to move on here. So a lot of the action was right here. As he came riding through, he did not say the British are coming, because everyone was British. He said the regulars are coming. And he went to Hancock. He went to Samuel Adams. Get out of Dodge. They're coming to arrest you. They barely escaped. Of course, if you go to that place today, the flagpole and the farmer militiaman is pointing right down the road. He's looking down the road where the British column would have come. And some 77 of them stood their ground as the British aligned. Shots were fired, 8 fell dead. Their lives were ended. Blood had been shed. They went on another 7 miles to Concord. You know the story. They were turned back and so forth. Here's another time tunnel question for us. Were the founding fathers, that's a tough one. Were the founding fathers in compliance with Romans chapter 13? I spent an hour and a half in my office with a gentleman who was convinced that the founding fathers were out of God's will and that the founding of America was not something that God favored. And I said, well, tell me what you know about the Prohibitory Act. What? What do you know about the Olive Petition? Never heard of that. And here again, I don't claim to have the last word on this, but at least do your research. Try to come to reasoned conclusions. The whole Romans 13 is a fascinating study in our relationship to government. God ordained a church, God ordained a family, and each has its proper role in place. In fact, after blood was shed, there were still efforts to try to mitigate the situation. Some say, they just did that as a gesture for their conscience sake. They really didn't mean it. You can say what you wish there, but here's the kicker. Here's the one that really drives us over the top here. The British passed a resolution that was so contested that they smuggled it into the colonies in barrels of flour to hide it. Essentially, if you take the time to read through it, it kicked the colonies out of the empire. That's what it did. It kicked them out. It enforced a blockade. It seized American ships. It actually called for the hiring of Hessian troops. Never had the British government used foreign troops in an internal affair. The British were treating American colonists as if they were no longer a part of. There was no choice but to take up arms to defend themselves. And where did that happen? Well, if this is the hospital in which America was born, here's the delivery room, Independence Hall. I've been there several times to stand there and just try to absorb what might have been like when these folks gathered and talked these things over. By the way, there's so much credit given to Thomas Paine. I wish I had the time to shake this bush for a bit. The secular historians love to really play up the role of Thomas Paine. Listen, he was a latecomer. What he wrote in Common Sense already was being preached from the pulpits, and the way he crassly treated the king insulted many of the colonists. Thomas Paine, and some of you watching may disagree, so check it out, let me know what you think. He was more comfortable in the French Revolution than he was in the American War for Independence. He was a deist. And even when he came back to the States, he was a bitter, broken man, lived out his life in New York. And one of the reasons why he was so isolated is that he was so hostile in his attack on Christianity. So let's not buy into the, what did I call them? The historical Canaanites interpretation. I'd say the Great Awakening played a much larger role than did. Now, I'm not taking away, he did play a role, to be sure. And so did prayer. Wow, this first 3-hour prayer session they had in 1774, they said there wasn't a dry eye in the place. There were other prayers along the way, and of course, the actual writing of the Constitution. Cindy, I refer to this as the first Google Doc. Yeah, Jefferson write, and then Adams was writing his notes, and Franklin writing his notes over top of that. Here's another resource for those that want the deeper dive. It's a great work, and this will actually be a great key tee-off for the science panel we're going to have, because this author shows the biblical foundations and the view that they had towards science in the emergence of this new country. How that God is the one that gave man, endowed him. It's not government that gives us, it's God-given, and they're simply asserting that right. One of the grievances they listed was that the British were forcing them to continue the slave trade. They tried multiple times to stop that. Now, they were conflicted. There were some that were very strong in their support of slavery. There were others who were very anti-slave, founding fathers that is, and they had to work that through. These were flawed people. We all are, right? We all have blind spots. But the point is, now the reason that didn't show up in the final version is that South Carolina and Georgia would never vote for that, and they wanted unanimity. When the announcement was made, of course, July 2nd is when they passed the resolution. July 4th is when they approved the wording. So that's why we celebrate July 4, but really the decision was made July 2, and Adams predicted that would be the day of fireworks. I suggest you do them on both days. So here comes the Declaration of Independence. We don't worship it, but we see in it God's providence at work in a great way. The bells rang, the celebration. But you know, it was not long after that this experiment almost was snuffed out. If we go just briefly, I have time for one more illustration. We'll have to leave some things on the table. It's now August of 1776. Washington had been appointed commander-in-chief. By the way, there were others that had more military experience, that had higher credentials, but they were not people of integrity. It was his integrity that put him into that position. And the Lord used him tremendously. But things didn't look good here. The British basically thrashed them on August 27, if you want to look at the date line and the place. And then he called his officers together and said, we're going to try to get out of here. They said, we can't do it. We might as well dig in and die like men here. There's no way. You cannot get across the East River when the British have all of their ships. You know how sound travels on a hot, humid night in August? He said, we're going to do it. So they got their plans together, and once you believe it, as Lady Luck would have it, a storm settled in. I say that facetiously. And that storm began blowing through, and they were rowing back and forth, but the storm abated at about midnight. The group, though, running those oars were from Connecticut. How about that? And they knew how to row without washing the oars, so quietly all night long, back and forth. And George Washington was on the last boat across. When the sun was coming up, they said, we're not going to be able to make it out. We're going to get caught here in transit. And a fog arose. Every journal there tells a story about a fog that was so thick you could not see a person at 6 paces. And that fog stayed in place until Washington was on board. That fog was burning off. As the British ran down the shoreline. They fired a furtive volley, fell short. Washington lived to fight another day. And we could regale ourselves with those kinds of stories for the rest of the evening, but the evening is pretty much expired. So let me just jump to this final concluding statement. This is what you'll find on a monument that I want to talk more about in our second session, Lord willing. Thus, out of small beginnings, greater things have been produced by God's hand, that made all things of nothing and gives being to all things that are. And as one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shone unto many. Yea, in some sort to our whole nation, let the glorious name of Jehovah have all praise. And so my parting challenge here is, why curse the darkness when you can light a candle? Pastor Zach?
Let's thank Dr. Reese, everybody, tonight. Thank you. We were reminded, we learned new things.